Yeah, please. Oh, I set the recording to start automatically.
It's Chuck.
Thanks for everybody joining us online. And for about the next 10 minutes or so, we're just going to take a short spell of shamatha. I think everybody here has had plenty of instruction about basic meditation practice, and that's all we're going to do. But if anybody needs any sort of special reminders, please feel free to. No. Tap up as my instruction, no, that's too possible. No, much.
Which Chuck just connected.
Okay. Teacher will now try to take dignified posture. So Thank you, everybody. That concludes our brief session of entry. Shamatha. Don't mind, I'd like to bow in just to give our gesture of respect and dignity to each other before we carry on. So, hello, I'm Colin. I'm the person sitting on the hotspot, flexing with his watch while everybody's watching. I can definitely go on, give a greater spiel about myself for everybody, but I'm always very interested to first hear about what brings people to hear me talk about anything. It's always a very curious situation to be sort of in a teacher's chair and wondering what people are looking for, what people are interested in, what kind of brings them into the room. Really, anybody feel like being the first popcorn on the on the pan to introduce themselves? Presence at the stage.
So, I guess simply put, Tuesday night I patient and felt attracted, very positive. So once in a while I woke up, I checked it out, and didn't vanish, so I understood right away. Now where that comes from is probably because of the new path. New certified coach for coaching. And as part of the integral coaching, competency of spirituality, which has made me go back to my spirituality more closely in the past since I started on the journey, which is probably the beginning of COVID. But it was not COVID that shows in my core. Yeah, so that's and in terms of integral coaching, the idea is mind, soul, and spirit, and so always we have to be on our own individual journey. So as the coach, particular journey, that's the main recent journey. There's more.
But it's a recent karmic velocity.
Yeah.
That's super cool. Well, I think we've got a couple other friends or members of the center actually who've gone through integral coaching. I can think of one offhand, but there's somebody else who I don't recall. So it's interesting to have people with that kind of experience popping up in the center. It's a new thing. So Gilbert.
My name is Gilbert. It's 3 years ago. Not much older. Maybe because I was reading times actually for both traditional materialism. I want to
Cool. Very logic. Oh, Conzi. Very logical. Thanks very much for coming.
And yes, I've spoken about this, about the course along these lines, and maybe a couple of years back.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very pleased when you informed us this together because I'm getting acquiring a better understanding of ideologies is around the world is important, and for me to see the connection with well, Buddhist teachings in this regard, or the connection between Buddhist teachings and ideologies, as well as analyses from other non-Buddhist sources. So yeah, I'm very interested in it and very happy that you're getting this.
Yeah, and actually, thanks Doug for actually being the one to actually like prod me to actually start doing stuff like this, because it was you and one other member who actually was like, can you actually just like teach teach this stuff instead of like talking talking about it over coffee every once in a while.
Oh, really?
So send all thanks and compliment to Doug, email or text.
Yeah.
Chuck, I think you're with us online. Do you want to give a brief spiel of your own? I think
He's there.
you're there. Okay.
I'm also wondering whether the volume is okay for him.
I don't know.
Chuck?
Is he unmuted?
Yeah,
That's it.
is my microphone working?
No, maybe he stepped away from the. Yeah, he's unmuted. Okay, Chuck, we can't hear you. I'm gonna try to switch the speaker. No, that's fine. No, now you mute. Try speaking again.
Yeah, I should be mute.
No, we can't hear you, Chuck. It might be a problem with your mic.
Yeah, it kept,
Oh, no, there you are. The sound is just too low. Here, I'll turn up our sound. There we go.
okay. Yeah, I just, I couldn't hear the previous participant too well. But yeah, I've got a long-standing interest in the power of ideology, which is probably especially used for politics, and the way that people align themselves with an ideology and then hang on to it like mad, and wondering all the time if I'm doing the same thing. So yeah, there's my interest.
Hmm. Yeah, and you've worked in elections quite a bit over the years too, eh, Chuck? So you've kind of been more on the front lines than most of us have been.
Yes, I have, and yeah, it becomes particularly evident, and a great variety of the ways that these things happen, going from culture to culture.
Hmm. Yeah, ideology has long since become an international phenomenon after having just been like a small little European thing for a few generations.
You don't think it's always been everywhere?
Well, we're going to examine the question.
Okay.
I'm going to say that. Something nice and non-committal from a teacher.
That's what I'm looking forward to anyway, exploration.
Hmm. And so a brief hello to you as well to the people who are going to be listening to this and recording. I think there are 2 or 3 of you who are going to be watching this later due to work schedules. Oh yeah, me. So my name is Colin Kortner, as I mentioned before. I am the current director of the Ottawa Shambhala Center. And a previous iteration of my present life, I was also a graduate student in political science at Carleton University, where I actually specialized in, I guess, studying and nucleating the sorts of political and spiritual phenomena we usually call ideologies or political religions, or under a variety of other names. But just the question of exactly what it was about what was going on in the West that gave rise to these sorts of political movements that we all either know about or have experienced directly over the last, basically 2 centuries. a long history of like extremely violent revolutions which have happened since the French Revolution, but really peaking around the time of the Second World War. And so the question for me was always, where is all this coming from? What sort of underpins this peculiar thing, which we call ideology? What is the aim? What is the ground? What is the aim? We know what the path is. It usually is some form of like massive attempt to remake the world in somebody's image. And so when I put this course together, it was with the intention of trying to bring together like Eastern and Western sources on the subject matter together. So not only what is the general scope of the Western literature on the problem or on the issue, but what does the traditional Buddha Dharma or Shambhala Dharma have to say, which can actually help us to investigate it a little bit further. Somebody mentioned the idea, it's like, to what extent does this actually exist within me? Or to what extent does the seed of this sort of problem exist within me, or could be taking flower within me or around me? How would I even know about that particular aspect of my cocoon, to use Shambhala jargon, right? And there is this very interesting teaching, which usually goes overlooked in the West, in the general Buddha Dharma, about collective karma. And this idea that karma is not our own particular individual thing exactly. Yes, we do have our own particular cocoons, we have our own particular habits, we have our own particular flair and style of being wise or being foolish. However, we do not exist as separate, independently existing beings. We are actually living in an interdependent situation at all times. And one of the deepest, most entangled aspects of our interdependence is the sort of collective karma of the society or the culture in which we grow up, which itself has a huge amount of history behind it usually. Oftentimes Buddhists talk about lineage and remembering the lineage and remembering all the efforts and the personalities which have sort of carried the teachings forward. But that's not just uniquely a Buddhist thing. It's like everything has history behind it. And our interdependence is not just with what's going on right now or in our own particular biographies, but it also involves the depths of our family history, the depths of our ancestors, the depths of the families and ancestors of everybody we've ever interacted with, obliquely or directly, the history of our language, the history of the religious structures, institutions which were informed our culture. And so nothing comes out of nowhere, I guess is sort of the upshot of it. So with this idea of collective karma, I think, and maybe we'll find out differently as we go along, is one way which I think the Buddhist teachings sort of help us to broaden out our perspective on the subject of not only spiritual materialism, but ideology more specifically. This idea that we can't separate ourselves out perhaps as easily from the spirit of ideology as we would like to presume we can. Because if we live in a culture in which ideology has been predominant as a way of thinking and acting in the world for perhaps generations, perhaps even centuries, then that very fact that that is the soil in which we have grown up has to be investigated somewhat closely if we're not just going to be blindly subject to those influences. Does that sort of more or less make some kind of sense? Okay. Even reluctant acceptance is good. And so, as I think I mentioned in the emails, but I'll mention it again. The general structure of the class is that I was going to take this class for us to just, me talk, and then later on we will discuss the readings for this week, which were just the first 11 pages or so of cutting through spiritual materialism, in which Chogyam Trungpa lays out a particular way of looking at the way in which our confused mind operates, or misoperates. And he uses a very interesting teaching of the three lords of materialism as a way of sort of like framing the discussion. So that'll be class 1 or talk 1. After the talk in each class, we'll also have like a period break, a bio break, tea, cookies, that sort of thing. And we'll come back and we'll do some sort of contemplative meditation, which will actually help us focus in on the topic of the talk. And then we'll have like a larger sort of like open format discussion about the subject matter of the entire class up to that point. That's reasonably clear, I think. Okay. If not, please just email me again and I'll. Sorry for drinking a lot of water, but I have terrible allergies this time of year and I just cannot keep my mouth moist. I'm sure it makes for an interesting recording.
Yeah.
So just by way of being like somewhat logical in the way in which I'm going to try to progress over the next 5 weeks, what I'm going to lay out is like an hypothesis or an assumption that we'll start off with just to get us going. And then hopefully over the next few weeks, it'll become clearer to what extent that assumption has to be adjusted. I'm not going to suggest that you have to take anything I say for granted. And I actually hope that people will, critically challenge anything I'm saying or like examine for different perspectives. So just take what I say basically as an hypothesis that we're just going to use for the sake of starting off the journey rather than some set point, which I hope we're all kind of like settle on immediately. And I'm just going to try to convince you for 5 weeks. That I think would probably be against the spirit of what the course is about, which is really observing the nature of fixed ideas and being able to loosen up or relax about them, to allow them to be able to dissipate or to relate to the real world in a much more gentle and open fashion. And so the premise, the assumption, the hypothesis I'm going to present here is that ideology is not something that has always existed everywhere, all the time, among human beings.
It's not.
Is not. Ce n'est pas quelque chose qui a toujours existé. Rather, what I'm going to suggest as a hypothesis is that ideology, like every other phenomena in the human world or outside the human world, is something that arose under very specific causes and conditions and persists only as long as those causes and conditions persist. Same way that a flower requires soil, water, and sunlight, and certain other conditions of temperature, season, and so forth. The things of the mind, of the human mind, and of human society also need their own very specific causes and conditions in order to grow and thrive and persist. It's going to suggest that ideology is not something different from that. And so if ideology is something with specific causes and conditions, with specific grounds for its existence, then presumably we should be able to identify what those causes and conditions are, and also be able to discriminate ideology from other human phenomena. Is ideology, for instance, different from religion, or what we call religion? Is ideology something different from spirituality? Is ideology something different from just having a political position or a favorite political party or something else of the sort? All these things are open questions or can be treated as open questions. And so what we'll be doing is essentially figuring out what tools and what discriminations we can make to determine what the specific nature of ideology is, what it isn't, in what ways it is good or bad in either a conventional or dharmic sense. And what, if anything, can be done or should be done about it, either on a personal or societal level. Something like that. Now, in cutting through spiritual materialism, Trungpa just very briefly touches upon ideology when he speaks about three forms of materialism. By the way, did everybody get a chance to actually read through the readings for this week? Is everybody okay if I just like summarize? Okay, good. So just as a brief reminder to everybody, the three lords of speech that Trungpa outlines are the Lord of Form, the Lord of Speech, and the Lord of Mind. Right? The three lords of materialism, not three lords of speech. Each one of these lords is basically symbolizes some different way in which our cocoon or our ego gets caught up in an activity which is destined just to maintain the cocoon or the ego's own existence, to maintain that sort of like basic split in which we want ourselves to really, 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 really exist in a hard, identifiable, eternal fashion in some way, shape, or form. And to do so by both gluing ourselves together, but also gluing some sort of external situation together. Basically to create some sort of situation somehow or other, which will maintain our sense of ourselves as this, as opposed to that. It is a basic sort of safety reflex, you might say, in which we're trying to constantly build something up out of nothing, oftentimes. And one of the primary ways in which we do that habitually is through these three different styles in which we all engage with to some extent. Lord of Form being that sort of that habit or reflex to like glom on to particular things in the material world. Could be fashion, could be food, could be drink, could be just having stuff in some way, shape, or form, and sort of build up a sense of ourselves through the acquisition of material comforts or material possessions. The Lord of Speech refers more specifically to our more discursive or conceptual habits, the way in which we build up very complicated narratives about the world, about ourselves, about each other. And Trungpa puts most ideology and religiosity in this category, the ways in which we use these complicated systems of ideas in order to build up some sense of security for our egos. That we use these conceptual systems as a fine wrapping of our cocoon to protect ourselves in some way, or to have it take some solid grasp about the situation. And the Lord of Mind is a little bit more subtle. Trungpa only talks about it in terms of basically ways in which the ego can appropriate and abuse spirituality of any sort, Buddhism included, Shambhala Dharma included, to once again reify some fairly subtle but still reified sense of the self. In like very traditional Buddhist terms, there's oftentimes discussion about how even like the most profound meditations can be used to simply abide in some seemingly permanent eternal bliss state. And the Buddha and many of his disciples in the sutras often point out to people the dangers of actually getting too attached to meditation practices. Because they recognized in those particular students this habit of like trying to like dwell in what's usually called the God realm through the meditation practices. Like, I'm finally abiding in like second or third jhana. It's a very blissful state, actually. It's a really nice time, actually, if you actually go into some of this jhana or dhyana states of meditation, which are legitimate practices. But there is this almost automatic desire to like dwell in some of these states and just stop there, spiritually speaking, for that pursuit of like great bliss or profundity to become the end point of the journey. And we could do much the same thing with rituals. We could do the same thing with theology or philosophy, and we could do the same thing with psychedelic drugs of one sort or another. All these things are like very familiar to us at this point, I think, after like a century and a half of experimenting with every drug and every spirituality under the sun in North America. So that was Chogyam Trungpa's general overview and cutting through. So the three lords of speech are constantly with us, and they're constantly, I'm going to say, nice poly-sci term, operationalize their tools to get us to re-engage with this process of constantly building ourselves up, and constantly trying to freeze everything around us into particular things. Gilbert is just Gilbert, Doug is just Doug, Ian, Chuck is Chuck. They are who they are, plain and simple. I am who I am. And somehow by gluing myself together and gluing yourself together and gluing our relationships or my perception of our relationships in particular ways, this creates some sense of security, even if it's not really a very comfortable security. We have, for instance, very interesting relationships with people who perceive to be our enemies. And some of us really build ourselves up around regrets, resentments, our combativeness with certain people. And even though in any normal way, we wouldn't consider these sorts of relationships of like constant warfare and being pleasant in a normal sense, we are actually getting something out of that. Oftentimes, by being able to distinguish me from you in like a very hard fashion, even if it's an extremely unpleasant sensation to hate somebody or hate something, it nevertheless builds us up. I am me because you are you and I don't want to be you, or I hate you. It's like, it's as simple as that sometimes.
It's a kind of type of polarization.
So, yeah, it's polarization. And it's a very basic human experience. We all do it to one extent or the other, but in certain situations, it becomes a really huge political mess or social mess. And it becomes wrapped up with, very wrapped up with that lord of speech, with these systems and webs of ideas about how things should be, how things should not be, both for me and for everybody else. That relationship of enemyship itself becomes the basis of the ego in a weird sort of way. That seems pretty clear to everybody. Nobody seems to be particularly quizzical so far. So I guess if that's fairly clear, then where I'll go to next, continue on our journey, is to suggest something which in some ways is a bit of a disagreement with Trungpa. I don't think it's actually a big disagreement. I think it's actually more of an expansion. So Trungpa, as I mentioned, sort of puts ideology to cool in with the Lord of Speech, that ideology at its core is mostly about the systems of ideas. And I think he's right about that. One thing which is pretty obvious about most ideologies, or things we would consider ideologies without thinking about it in a common sense way, have a lot of ideas which link together in more or less solidified patterns, which may be more or less logical. What I'm going to suggest, though, is that at the very least, there are classes of ideologies which link up fairly well with the Lord of Mind as well, in a very specific way. And that way is that much as certain meditation practices or certain spiritual religious practices can be turned around to become about sort of solidifying the sense of the self, whether that be sort of like nice little temporal self, me, myself, and I here on this earth, or some sort of transcendental self, either the Brahman or the Atman, or me as an angel in God's heaven, something of that sort. There is this sort of but I don't know if it's more subtle, but there's this other dimension of the Lord of Mind, which is this inclination to not try to transcend the present human condition, the normal sort of human life situation, in order to escape to some sort of more blissful eternal state. But there is actually the flip or reverse situation in which one can actually not try to escape into eternity, but try to drag eternity into the present moment, or drag eternity into the world. In sort of more common terms, this is the effort to like bring about the end of history, or bring about, you know, what do certain circles call it? That's the rapture, right? In certain fundamentalist Christian circles in the States, they talk about bringing about the rapture, or bringing about the transformation or transfiguration of the earth, or bringing about heaven on earth, or all the various ways in which we hear about this. We're sort of familiar with this concept of trying to bring eternity into the world, or bring about the end of history. Those of us who are like fairly broadly familiar with history of religions, we know that there are sects have always kind of been obsessed with the apocalypse, to one extent or the other, and want to take an active hand in bringing about the apocalypse in some way, shape, or form. All I'm going to add to that is that in the very peculiar history of how Europe and then the West developed in the last few centuries, that sort of apocalypticism, or that sort of apocalyptic consciousness itself got secularized, along with other dimensions of the Judeo-Christian tradition. So it's not probably too surprising to us to hear that certain elements of, you know, Christianity got secularized and became more worldly. Charity, for instance, being a thing we usually consider to be awesome.
Usually what, sorry?
We usually consider to be awesome, to be a good thing.
Yeah.
Which comes out of the Christian tradition, right? It's like not every human society has had that very powerful aspiration towards charity. Speaking as somebody who spent a lot of time studying human civilizations, it's just not something that always happens. People, there have always been good people, kind people, and so forth. But the idea of there being a calling to charity is pretty intense in some traditions, and if not absent, then much more attenuated in most other traditions, human societies. Within Europe, Europe was an almost entirely Christian continent. Well, we can now read about it, at least from the 13th century. Most of Europe was mostly Christian from the 13th century onwards. But then at some point, Europe started secularizing, right? The worldly powers became stronger. They started pushing the church out of certain situations. Secular powers had to justify themselves in some way, shape, or form. And because, you know, the emerging secular European societies grew out of a formerly non-secular, extremely Christian society, many of the ideas or impulses of even like the Enlightenment movement and then the post-Enlightenment movement in your European tradition brought with them many of the Christian impulses without a lot of the sort of checks and balances of the Christian tradition itself. And so one thing which we end up starting to see in modern times, specifically within Europe, is this sudden impulse for using politics as a means of bringing about perfection on earth. Not to bring about regime change, right? Not just like to bring about a democratic state or to reinstall a king or to change kings or to bring about an oligarchy, which had been going on for thousands of years. But the idea that through the proper actions or activities or the proper institution of systems or ideas or institutions, or by killing the right people, one could bring about a transformation of the human condition and of human society such that it will become perfected. So this is what I'm going to suggest, or what we're going to explore over the next few weeks, is the dimension of modern Western politics, which is novel. It's this combination of secularization, which happened, but a secularization which happened in the context of like a very religious society with extremely high moral aspirations. Actually, if we step back and look at it, the moral aspirations of Christianity are very, very high. But those moral aspirations combined with this underlying element or sort of like thread of what I've just sort of called apocalyptic consciousness or messianic consciousness. This idea of either there being like a great redeemer who will bring about the golden age on earth, or at the very least that there is some perfected state that should or will come about. The only change is that nobody's under an ideological umbrella or under an ideological framework. There's no kind of waiting around for God to do it anymore. Man has deified himself, to use traditional Western terms, and is going to take it upon themselves to bring about the end of history. Because if God does exist, God doesn't care. Why wait for God? And probably God doesn't exist anyway. So if we have this consciousness of perfection, it's up to us to do it. And so that attempt to bring about perfection on earth is the novel new thing that arises first in Europe, and then of course with the sort of imperial age of exploration over the last few centuries, Western forms the way of doing things gets spread across the world and gets imposed on much of the world, and so ideology gets exported along with, you know, cornflakes and automobiles and Western science and technology, basically. Okay, I should probably stop for a moment. Let people consider. I should drink more water.
When you talk about dimension of modern politics, talking about politics today or 20th century?
Modernity kind of vaguely defined as everything since like 16th century or so, really.
16th century. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, political scientists and historians kind of like dicker about exactly what century they think the modern era started. I don't think we need to dicker about it too much. But certainly since like the Enlightenment took full possession of the Western sort of destiny, as it were, and up to and including today. Yeah.
When you say, you just use the word enlightenment, I think, you've used it before. What do you refer to as enlightenment in that context?
Oh, yeah, sorry. So I'm not talking about like
Yeah.
what usually gets translated in Buddhism as enlightenment, which actually isn't enlightenment. It's actually awakening. It's technically the term it's used in Buddhist talk. I'm talking more about the European Enlightenment. So the idea that man, through his own rationality, is thrown off the yoke of tradition and revelation and so on and so forth. Nothing necessarily bad, right? The idea of human reasoning being given priority over like blind faith, which is the way the Enlightenment started off.
I think it's very difficult to make its own mind because everybody is getting this idea about things with their tools. And this is, how to say, it is something coming up from somewhere and other things coming up with the other side and so on. It's all the time about saying, the other and experiencing on the other and make pressure on the other one and how to say and people say that the ethics is no more how to say the conditions for something to happen, let's say. It's hard to understand all this current coming up, coming down, and so on, and they work with something, and because of the media, the news that like that, you know what's happening. You understand what's happening, and you say, okay, that's it. That's the way this, and that's the way that, whatever. If we don't like it, or we like it, then we manage it in some ways, and the others with that. So it is, how to say, it's reactions to ideologies from religions also from many different places, quite influence the other ones, and so on. It's bouncing everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're right. It's become like a gigantic ping pong game where, yeah, as you're saying, it seems as like basic ethical grounding is not becoming the basis for people to talk to each other or even discuss things, but rather we get so wrapped up in our own particular ping pong ball, which we're throwing against the other person, and that person is doing the same thing back to us. That it's the speediness and the aggression of the ideas and the energy we're putting behind them is taking over conversation completely and our interactions completely, which I think is a legitimate observation.
Yeah, but it's not only my country or the country. Yeah, I see that with my relations. The world, they say, no, this is not good. This should be like that, and so on. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard to be the relation with people. This function. Like one of my sister, I told her, okay, there are some subjects we don't want to agree on that. We can put on the side and be together on what we can manage, can trust, can exchange. There is a value of experiencing or being in relation with people. So this is something special. It's like,
yeah, it's become much more pervasive than even it was 30 or 40 years ago. That when even our personal relationships become sort of a little bit overpowered by our fixation upon certain ideas and how we just cannot stand our brother, sister, mother, father, uncle, cousin, friend for having that idea. Yeah. Right? We just can't sit down at the table anymore. It's not even that we can just agree to not talk about it. That thing we consider to be touchy. But that's a greater and more pervasive sense these days that everybody has to be on side. That somehow the level of assertive, well, I was going to say assertiveness, but the amount of aggressiveness we have about trying to defend our ideas is expanded out so much that we're actually more willing than ever to actually destroy relationships, or to at least damage them or threaten them, in order to defend that concept that we have, that things should be like that and not like that. This should happen, that should not happen. All right.
So if I understood the Lord of Speech properly, if this is the Lord of Speech aspect, is that true?
I think so. I think it's definitely predominantly the Lord of Speech. I think at the kitchen table level for most of us, most of the time, we're not necessarily trying to bring about heaven on earth or bring about transformation of the world. However, we are very wrapped up in the ideas of the times, right? This is where this interdependence and this collective karma thing comes back in. Like this all might have started off very small, like a small segment of thinkers in Europe, 500 or 600 years ago. But in Europe, it became very pervasive over the course of a few centuries. And there was a ping pong thing that happened in Europe as well, is that these thinkers attacked the church responded by becoming even more dogmatic and obnoxious. French Revolution happened. French Revolution directly attacked the church, killed a lot of people with, dollars. Church overreacted to that by considering all democracy to be a fundamental threat. And then failed to step up in order to sort of back up democratic regimes in the wake of the First World War, Spanish Civil War, Second World War, and only very belatedly reverse course after the Second World War to finally say, whoa, we thought liberalism was the worst thing that could ever happen. Then we saw communism, fascism, Nazism, and Maoism, right? So ping pong, ping pong, ping pong. These reactions, whether we consider them wise or unwise, are happening for reasons, historical reasons. And if you step back far enough, you can actually sort of start to see what was going on, why this institution reacted so foolishly to the situation over here. But this actually kind of dovetails us back nicely, and hopefully I'll wrap this up in a few minutes before we can take our break. To one of the other readings from Trungpa, which was on the Kleshas. So we talked about the three lords of materialism, lords of form, speech, and mind, as particular manifestations, particular ways in which we try to constantly preserve ourselves. But I think underlying those are these more fundamental impulses of the ego, which we typically label as kleshas in Buddhist teachings. And actually, I was going through the Profound Treasury of the Ocean of Dharma, which is a collection of teachings by Trungpa, a very big collection of teachings. And he has a very interesting way of presenting the kleshas in that particular first volume, in which he seems to be suggesting that you can actually look at the kleshas as sort of conflictual impulses or negative impulses. Kind of hard to translate the word klesha. We usually translate it as negative emotions, but it's actually more than just emotions per se. Kind of lists the 6 fundamental or root kleshas as almost like a sequence of things which happen very, very quickly within us. So step 0 is avidya, or fundamental primordial ignorance. That's a little bit beyond the scope of our talk, but basically, some point in primordial time, there was this kind of basic split or freak out in which we developed a sense of I, everything else. That's a fundamental ignorance. Avidya.
Fundamental ignorance.
Yeah, primordial ignorance. This is just, he describes it, actually, I think in Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism as being almost like a basic blackout, like almost the polar opposite of awakening or enlightenment. Then after that, things sort of spin up a little bit. And after avidya, primordial ignorance or bewilderment, we get into the realm of passion. But not passion in a normal sense of the word. It's almost this like sense of reaching out and wanting to grasp onto something. So the way Trungpa presents it, actually, this starts off not as trying to reach out, but almost as a way of trying to reach in, almost as a way of trying to like make love to yourself in order to preserve your own existence. And then after that, the momentum takes you automatically to some level of subtle or not so subtle aggression. Like getting everything else to back off in some way, shape, or form. Aggressing anything which threatens the sense of making love to yourself, or the sense of fundamental bewilderment. It's like you're bewildered, and then you try to like grasp on, you try to make love to yourself in one way, shape, or form, and then you just like kind of react blindly to everything else. And then after that sort of aggression has taken place, then there's another instance of ignorance. Let me double check this actually. The sequence is interesting. I want to make sure I'm getting it right. I think he goes to Moha next. No, actually, pride. Now, this is one of the more interesting parts. So because passion and aggression aren't particularly working all that well, they don't work particularly well at keeping together this thing, which is fundamentally just open, spacious, empty in a positive, more or less positive sense of the word. Since those don't really work, what we fall back upon is some sort of sense of pride, of like, lève le menton, as we sometimes say in French. We gotta just like kind of chin up, kind of almost like a stubborn sort of like sense of ourselves in spite of everything. So passion is not really working, aggression is not really working, and almost in spite of that reality, there's a sense of sticking your chin up and then digging your feet in. And then after pride, in order to maintain that sense of yourself, that prideful sense of yourself, and you're already sort of like malfunctioning mechanisms of passion and aggression, you add another layer of ignorance. This is confusing in the Buddhist teachings because there are like several different words can be translated as ignorance. But this is not like the basic sort of bewilderment, this fundamental blackout ignorance. This is more like this active process of acting dumb and stupid or ignoring things all the time. Because we want to have things that we like, we want to identify things we don't like. Then there's this vast universe of things which we can't really peg them down as we like them or we don't like them. And so our mechanism for dealing with all that reality, that vast universe of things which escapes our pushing and pulling, just by like, whatever, ignore. And we expend a huge amount of energy on ignoring, actually. It's interesting. If you've ever spent a long time meditating in the retreats,
Yeah.
and then you go out in the world and you say, wow, that faculty of ignorance is somehow like calm down, and you start really noticing everything. It's like you start really liking flowers after you meditated for a while. That's for sure. Yeah, it's an interesting experience, right? And then after that, he places in the sequence doubt and opinion. Now, doubt is. I'm just gonna because this is basically just refusal to kind of step forward. The word doubt comes from a Latin word, dubeo, which is an interesting word because it literally means you were walking and then all of a sudden you just stopped. You stopped walking. You just didn't want to take another step forward. You just like halted. This is a sort of hesitation to go any further. So this form of doubt, the most basic form of doubt, is just it's like a subtle refusal somehow. So it's almost like another advancement of ignorance. So this is kind of, don't want to do that. You want to maintain your sense of like, well, I want to question that. I don't think I'm gonna. And so you maintain your human right to doubt everything, but somehow you never quite follow up on actually investigating anything properly, right?
Those can make raising questions about do I am doing things right or not?
Exactly. It's interesting,
And
right?
This is something positive.
Yeah.
I say, okay, using the situation because I had doubts and just came back and solved.
Yeah, this is something a little bit different from just having like the common sense or like scientific or philosophical attitude of like doubting before you try to investigate something or try to understand something or reserving judgment, right? Like you're saying, this is something like a little bit more fundamental because we're still talking about like just a defensive reflex of the ego to protect or the cocoon, it's just this attempt to maintain oneself by reserving the right to doubt even basic realities, right? You doubt the fact, you don't want to really believe that your passion, aggression, and ignorance aren't going to work out for you. This is the kind of doubt we're really talking about. This is really deep existential doubt, but not even existential in like a philosophical way. It's just more like, this is my mechanism for like just not fessing up to the fact that I'm making things worse all the time for myself and everybody else somehow or other, even if I don't really intend to. But I want to reserve my right to like not fess up to the fact that the way I'm doing things is not really working. That I'm really just trying to protect myself all the time at the expense of everything, including myself, strangely enough. So it's that kind of doubt. And the last one in the sequence is, I think it's drishti in Sanskrit, but it usually gets translated as fixed ideas or opinions. And this is where things really start taking off after this. Is that with this sixth klesha, which Trungpa here actually presents as one of the fundamental kleshas, we start developing like really strong views about things. I think the only thing I want to say about that right now is that this habit of having a fixed view or wanting to have fixed views about things, it's like Doug's like this, I'm like that, Gilbert is whoever he is, Gordon's doing whatever she's doing, Chuck I'm basically ignoring because he's on the screen, Margaret and George, those other guys aren't even here. It's like fixed ideas. Once you have fixed ideas, you start developing a much more sophisticated mechanism for like pigeonholing the world, not according to the world as it actually is, but pigeonholing the world according to ideas which are related to our own fundamental drive to maintain ourselves. Cats are good, dogs are bad, right? These people are, dogs are bad. Or the opposite, right? You have a fundamental position of no, cats are evil. Yeah, cats are satanic and dogs are heaven's, okay, heaven's chosen, right? Or, you know, these people are like this, those people are like that, right? And it becomes very spun up. And at this point, we're still talking about like a pretty universal human experience, having fixed ideas. Well, girls are like this, boys are like that, blah, 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 blah. But we can like really go full steam with this klesha, and we can develop a fairly impermeable set of stances and positions about pretty much everything that we're not ignoring. And just going to emphasize again before we take our break is that this is not only simply about us trying to maintain ourselves and maintain a sense of ourselves, all of us up to this point and beyond. But also it's just to point out that it's sort of, how would you almost say it? there is a sense of almost willful ignorance about the whole thing as well for all of us, to one extent or the other. That our way of expressing our passion, because it's ego-driven, doesn't particularly work. Our way of expressing aggression definitely doesn't work because it's also just ego-driven. Our way of ignoring things is perfectly self-centered because we just don't want to deal with stuff which doesn't interest us. It's not in our self-interest. And the way that we work with doubt and ideas also just serves this sense of like helping to maintain the three lords of mind, three lords of materialism, in their quest to like keep us wrapped up in ourselves in one way, shape, or form. So I think for like 10, 15 minutes, we're just going to put a pin on that, unless let's maybe have a tea of cookies. Maybe we'll make Doug, are you able to pause the recording? And,
Yeah.
And welcome back, everybody. Is our Zoom person back as well?
I think, are you there, Chuck? Maybe he's not.
Yeah,
Isn't he?
sure I am.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Signs of life. So I hope I didn't ramble too much in the first part of our wee exploration. Never realize how much you can talk until you give yourself a deadline of only 45 minutes to get through all your material. Now we're at this point, we're just going to drop talking, or at least drop me talking to you for a while, and we're actually going to go through Vipassana exercise. So for anybody who's watching who's not familiar with Vipassana, this is just the other category of meditation practices that are typically done within Buddhist traditions, Shambhala included. So whereas shamatha is basically amounts to peacefully abiding as a practice, or learning to just be, Vipassana, and this category of Vipassana is more of an investigative or insight practice in which one leverages whatever peace or stillness that has been cultivated during the shamatha practice to then turn the mind towards investigating some particular phenomenon. And so I'm going to try to do some sort of Vipassana practice each class in order to actually help us not just to talk about what we've been talking about discursively, but actually investigate to what extent, to whatever extent we can actually discriminate the phenomenon. That's a big cryptic way of saying it, but I don't want to give too much away before we actually do the exercise. My apologies for that.
Do you mind spelling the name of the practice so that I can
Vipassana? Wait.
look it up online?
Yeah. Vipassana. It's hard to remember Sanskrit on the spot, especially when
To single it out, yeah.
I'll let you know, there are like 40 different consonants in Sanskrit that don't exist in English, and so trying to figure out how to translate them is actually difficult.
Throw in this letter, throw in that letter.
Say that, there are literally 5 different S's in Sanskrit.
There is.
4 different N's.
Say something, day courses in Shambhala. And I think I haven't so much emphasized on it.
Yeah, there's a reason for that, because there's a particular way.
That's all. Because I was reading the book, the Chandama, or first book of the Tree Ones, which is Hinayana.
Profound treasures.
There it's really well explained, and it's found very good. I read and read that to try to myself understand. So I don't understand why it's put on the side when that's was put on my side, but I didn't find that.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm not going to try to answer that on camera to an extent, except to say is that it is actually part of like the basic Shambhala meditation teachings. It's done in a very particular way, which actually a lot of other traditions don't do it. What we do as we progress along the Shambhala curriculum, or Shambhala teachings, is we actually do shamatha prashana. We actually combine the two in a very particular way. That's a different course. That's a different class altogether.
It's just an interpretation.
No, it's a good observation because people actually often ask that. So just to get us into the practice part, so we have time for discussion at the end. So just start by taking your normal sort of dignified posture. We'll just begin with a good 5 or 6 minutes of plain old shamatha in whatever fashion or style you prefer. As you feel your mind begin to settle and relax, turn his attention towards investigating the nature of fixed ideas. Observe your present mind to see if you can experience the mental factor being described. Even if that factor, fixed view, is not naturally present right now, imagine what it would be like if it arose within you. This particularly includes incorporating ideas, eternalism or nihilism. So you have a general sense of what fixed ideas feel like in your experience. Spend some time scanning your own memory for times when this was present within your mind stream. Just derive a sense of what arises with that. Now consider the intensity of this mental factor. How does it manifest for you when it is strong? What is your state of being when this mental factor is strong within you? How is it manifested when it is weak? Barely noticeable in the background. To identify examples of your own experience of how you are when fixed views are foreground in your experience and when they are background. does it feel when this part of your cocoon is disturbed? Touched the wrong way, not affirmed. What arises? Consider the effects of this klesha. Something which would strengthen or let go of, given the choice. How could you work with it? Just rest with whatever insight has arisen for a few minutes. Proper practice and sip our tea, stretch our legs. Need to. Discuss the results of our experiment. No, you can't force Chuck to unmute. You can ask him to unmute. That's all.
Okay.
So he'll co-participate as he wills.
Right.
So we've had some amount of spiel for me framing fixed ideas, especially vis-a-vis what we're calling ideologies, and just suggesting some sort of link between one and the other. And what we focus in our practice upon, like basic root klesha, we just sort of investigated what's actually going on in our own experience. And probably we all have our own particular style. In fact, it's extremely likely, I think, that we all have our own particular style of experiencing this thing. I mean, personally, when I do this exercise, the thing or what comes up for me is, on the one hand, certain views automatically sort of provoke an angry response for me. Very obvious. It's physically manifest. I just like feel it in my chest and like automatically I'm gearing myself up. It has some sort of argument. On the other hand, it's just as interesting to look at how quickly I feel like I sort of a cloying, drawing in whenever it seems like somebody's saying something which affirms some system of ideas or some system of thought or story that I'm already like very committed to. Somebody wants to talk to me about this, I get very drawn in very, very immediately. If somebody wants to talk to me about that, I guess I don't want to talk about that. They're very, very visceral responses. And maybe I'll give other people a chance to speak before I keep on droning on.
About so anger is a response of mine, or it's sometimes fear, I think, as well, brings about a certain fixed view or something. And it's always a challenge to try and disarm it in the moment or something, because coming to realizing it is the first thing, and when I say to myself, "Oh, I actually do feel a fearful reaction here," I mean that can be sort of interesting in a moment, and it can help me not respond in a way that kind of engages with whatever the object is, the object of my annoyance or something like that. I don't know if this is making any sense, but I have to wonder, like, at what point, where do fixed views come in, if they come in at all? Because it sounds like fixed view in all cases is not a good thing. I mean, I just wonder whether Hogan Trunkpop or anyone that you might know of addresses these things. Like, a fixed view is one thing. Yes, we don't want to have fixed views because many people know that it leads to these things, Buddhists and non-Buddhists like anyone. But at what point, like, where do we stop? At what point should one have a fixed view? You know, I mean, I could say I have a fixed view that violence is a bad thing. That's my fixed view. And I sort of feel okay with that somehow. So, I mean, and maybe this is just part of my thinking. Like, I would say, well, yes, so no, yeah, that's okay. But other fixed views, things that have come into conflict with people or ideas or situations, you know, when I sort of dig in, that's when I think, oh, I'm grabbed in by this fixed view thing. I'm sort of, for some reason, it's getting at me, and I can either respond, you know, I can either choose to respond or not respond. And I can sometimes I feel like, oh, okay, yeah, I gave that, I was thoughtful about that, and my response was thoughtful, and it did seem to defuse it. Other times, just something I say without really thinking about it, and not even not anything necessarily, direct, but something just, I don't know, it's a challenge, that's all, I'll just say that.
Yeah. I don't know if it's helpful, but the only thing I could say is that another way of translating the word used for the klesha, it could also just be wrong view. And oftentimes teachers just like present it more softly as like just like wrong view. Certain views are just wrong, and they're mainly talking about any view which subtly or grossly refers to some form of materialism or some form of nihilism.
Mm.
And that is usually easier for people to navigate. Of course, when Trungpa does it, Trungpa is talking from like a very Mahayana, Vajrayana, Shambhala viewpoint. And as you progress along the path, you very easily run into like ethical situations in which it's not clear what the appropriate response is all the time, right? And in that case, the fixed view that we're trying to overcome is the idea that there's a proper thing to do all the time in this situation, or any similar situation, right? It's interesting because one of the ways, if you ever do the Bodhisattva vow, there's this practice called the 37 ways in which a Bodhisattva fails.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways in which the Bodhisattva fails is, practicing their discipline when it's not appropriate, practicing like not lying when it's going to like cause harm to somebody else. So for instance, the SS is at the door looking for Anne Frank, and are you honest with the SS soldiers, right?
Right.
It's like, it's actually not difficult for us to think of situations in which following the rules is actually going to cause harm, actually.
Yeah.
And that extends all the way up to like even what we normally call violence, right?
Mhm.
Self-defense or defense of others. And these are also considered ways in which a bodhisattva potentially fails, or just rigidly holding to the formal rules of the precepts without consideration of the practical consequences or the practical realities of being too rigid, too fixed. So even like the Vinaya vows of a monastic have to be like left aside sometimes. Same thing for anybody who's taking precepts or vows of this or that or the other. So I'll just offer that without trying to offer it.
I'm afraid I have to go. So
Say again, Chuck?
I think he said yes.
I'm afraid I have to go. I have to leave.
Okay, Chuck, thanks for joining us. Sorry that we went a bit over time.
Yeah, okay.
Catch you next time.
All right, will do.
Bye. So we'll keep the recording going. Anybody have any other thoughts or anything else that also need to take off?
This experience was circular in that I realized that I have a belief that fixed views are not good. And so the experience for me that just the history was about being that I also, as a result, I had a fixed view about myself that it is so wrong to fixed view that I was constantly judging myself for having a fixed view when a fixed view arises. Which is not surprising because I know that mental pattern is judgment. So as a result, I was caught in this loop of trying not to judge myself. I was actually forgetting that the way for me is to give myself some slack. So I guess the only way that the conclusion I came to was not to tighten up to loose with respect to the fixed views, as well as my own view of my fixed view. And and finally, yeah, and finally, I mean, for me as well, the major cliche that was at work when I was thinking of times when I've had fixed views, because I'm still trying now to mentally believe that I should not fix my view, that was anger, and aggression, and yeah, very yeah, and so went through all the stages, but anger, which does come back from time to time, but way less than in the last year. So mix of personal and the teaching.
Yeah, it's tricky. Yeah, it's also extremely personal because we have our own personal stuff, layers and layers of our own personal stuff. And when we do this, I mean, I certainly do the same thing with shamatha practice too, right? It's like shamatha practice literally means like just be there, be peaceful. And what do? It's like I wander off, I really club myself over the head in a totally peaceful way in order to make myself meditate harder, right? I've been doing this for a while and I'm still doing that, right? And so at a certain point it becomes like almost laughable, and there have been times I've literally started laughing at myself during practice because I'm acting like a complete maniac in the same way that I've been doing for like God knows how long. But there's that, somehow there's that loosening up process has to happen. I find at least in situations like that, that if I'm able to relax enough to give space for the craziness to just happen. The craziness itself doesn't have any substance aside from what I'm giving to it, right? I'm constantly pouring gasoline on a fire by trying to do something about it instead of just letting it burn out, right? So, but it's hard because I've got a whole mechanism for like pouring gasoline on fires.
Yeah.
I've been working on it for 45 years. You should see mine now.
And then the glaciers are there, right? I mean, these lords as well, and so.
Yeah, we got glaciers on top of our glaciers. We got.
Yeah.
Really.
And I would say that anger certainly, like, when I reopen my eyes and make that this definitely leading to suffering, right?
Yeah,
It's just suffering right there and then.
really.
And of course, in the radiance, but.
And they said to connected in with what Doug said earlier and what Gilbert said, much easier. Like imagine a situation where you're not a person who can actually stop yourself from immediately interacting with somebody based upon these things which have come up, right? Which is the vast majority of the human race much of the time. Is like, so we've done this little experiment with ourselves. We've seen that we do have some fixed ideas here and there, fixed views, perspectives. We have some that provoke fairly obvious responses from us. And we are people who meditate. And sometimes we still get ourselves into trouble, either internally and probably externally sometimes too. I mean, I'm married, so I get myself into trouble sometimes. And add all the speediness of our extremely modern life, and fast media and fast access to information, the ability to immediately respond to somebody on Facebook or Reddit or whatever, and a lack of tools to actually stop, to like not do harm. or not cause further harm. We're still talking at like at a fairly basic level too. We're still not talking about, you know, ideology too cool. We're just talking about like normal human level. Still, normal human level of fixed views, fixed perspectives, and I'm right, you're wrong.
Yeah.
And just adding a lot of speed on top of that. And adding on normal confused human aggression and normal confused human passion and doubt and opinionatedness.
Yeah. and then you put 7 billion.
Something like that.
8 billion. Ideologies. whatever the system. It's 30.
Yeah. So we're starting some sort of investigation, hopefully.
So just for my own notification, you said your projects were running overtime. I didn't know, yes, if I checked in so late, like, is it supposed to be 10 to noon? Or 10 to
Yeah.
1?
And to new. Yeah.
Okay.
Now we're trying to make people stay for 3 hours. So we went a little, we've gone a little bit overtime.
Okay,
So-
because I had put in my calendar 10 to 1, so, okay.
Yeah. Cars in the streets. Me too.
Yeah.
But I'm on Spencer where there's 2 hours.
Yes.
Me too. Yeah, no, that.
Yeah. I could actually park the cars further in and you guys could park at my place. I live very close by.
Hmm.
So if you want to consider that.
I take the bus, but I'm sure other people may.
That's.
You take the bus as well?
No, I
Okay.
drove.
Okay.
Thank you.
But, fixed idea, understand, like, creating commerce.
Like what, sorry?
Creating commerce,
Oh, yeah.
Karma.
because when you think something or whatever, an idea or whatever, the thing, we are stay with it, so we will get further impact. Whatever the there is there. This is someone.
Yeah. No, you're right. I mean, all the glaciers are ultimately karma producing. At the very least, they're always creating karmic potentialities or propensities. We may not express it, right? We may have a fixed view, but we might be mature and commonsensical human being enough to just shut up most of the time and not force our views on other people's throats, right? Most of us do most of the time. We don't have to like make everybody agree with us. However, just by having that reaction 1 million times a year, give or take, we're still like forcing it into our own mind stream, that habit of having fixed views, or at least having that particular fixed view, or that particular angry response to. So it's fostering, it's planting seeds, even though those seeds aren't getting watered, to use the old analogy. It becomes more complicated, of course, when we actually start expressing those glaciers out in the world, because then they're free range glaciers. And then either they bounce back at us immediately or they bounce back at us eventually just by creating an atmosphere around us, either within our household or within our society, of increased passion, aggression, ignorance, doubt, fixed views. That's where the collective karma thing comes in. So hopefully we'll be able to like expand upon that for the next few weeks and see how that has perhaps contributed to this particular phenomenon we're calling ideology. So maybe I'll not hold us and our cars in place, right? Further. And maybe we'll bow out, and if anybody wants to stick around to chat more, I'm happy to do that. I'm not in a rush, but otherwise, thank you much for coming out.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.